Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, cut off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
What you know good, Ann Camp? You're listening to the Ann Campaign's Church Politics Podcast with Justin Giboney, a.k.a. Bishop Cooper's grandson. And this is going to be a fun episode because this particular episode, I have two guests. Okay, so later I'll be talking to Dr. Ed Uszynski about his book, Untangling Critical Race Theory. But before we get to Dr. Uszynski, I have another brother that you have all seen before, who is Cory Ruth. He is a conservative politico and commentator here in Atlanta, and also a businessman and someone I consider a friend. Cory, thanks for joining us again, brother.
Thanks for having me. Always good to be here.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I'm glad you're back on. A lot is going on in politics. All right. We got the deportations to El Salvador, even though, a judge said those should be halted. And so there's a bigger conversation about whether a district court judge can stop the president from doing what they were doing. But something else that I saw, Cory, was that President Trump is now saying that Joe Biden's pardons of his son, Dr. Fauci, Liz Cheney, the folks on the committee for January 6th, all those pardons are void and vacant because Biden signed those pardons with an auto pen. But not only did he sign them with an auto pen, that he really had no idea what was going on at all. So basically somebody else was signing his signature while he had no idea what was going on. As a Republican, what do you take from this? Is this something that should be pursued? How do you take this?
Absolutely. I think there's a broader strategy going on here with the Trump administration. They're coming in saying, you know what, there's a lot of stuff going on that has never been constitutionally tested, right? We just started doing it. And so we're going to force this to be constitutionally reviewed by the Supreme Court. And so everything that he's doing across the board, he's welcoming the challenges in the courts. He wants to take this to the Supreme Court, force the Supreme Court to make decisions on these things. I go back to the birther issue, right? That started actually with John McCain, who was born on a ship in Panama. And the question was, can he be president? Not whether or not he's a citizen, but can he be president if he was born outside of the U.S.? The Constitution is very clear on that. Well, that's a gray area. And we never took that to the Supreme Court to say, answer this question. Forget Barack Obama, which I think was brought up for political reasons. But that question was never solved. And so there's so many things that we do that we just assume because, we want to do it. There's no law that clarifies things. And there's also the Supreme Court has never taken it up.
I mean, let me say this. I get that. I get that there are things that haven't been reviewed by the Supreme Court, and but we all do know that the president has the ability to make pardons.
He does.
What type of pen, whether it's electronic, which today, I'm pretty sure the founders weren't thinking about whether it would be electronic signature or not. This seems like something that's somewhat of a formality. And there's bigger fish to fry and other things that we could be talking about. And it comes off as a little bit petty. The man had the ability to do it. He spoke about some of the pardons he was making. He knew what was going on. You don't think this might just be a little bit of waste of time, a little bit petty here?
It's funny because I literally...
It's not even petty because it's a big deal. So I don't know if I can even call it petty. It's a substantive issue, but go ahead.
I say it's funny because right before I joined, I signed a legal document with an auto pen, right? So exactly. I did it. But I think this goes to the broader question of whether or not there was other people acting or authorized to act on behalf of the president. That stuff is going to come out in this Supreme Court battle, right?
Was he of sound mind, or was somebody else actually running
that's really what they're challenging here.
Executive office? Okay, we'll see what happens. But before we get all the way into it, let me please thank all our supporters and patrons for supporting us in what we do and how we do it. Man, I really appreciate y'all. And I just want you to know, if you like what you get here on the Church Politics Podcast, if you go to patreon.com/churchpolitics, you can actually get another segment in addition to this, just for supporting us. All right. So please think about that. If you're watching on YouTube, please be sure to like and subscribe. And you know how it goes, folks. Grab your Bible, get your mind right, and prepare to think, not like a Republican, not like a Democrat, but to think like a Christian. That is what we're challenging you to do. And if you don't mind, Cory, I want to go to scripture before we get into this conversation. So I want to go to Proverbs 11, verse 14, which says, "For lack of guidance, a nation falls, but victory is won through many advisors." For lack of guidance, a nation falls. Chris, Cory, I want to talk a little bit about leadership. Now, I know you've been paying attention, and Chuck Schumer is from New York. He's been in the Senate, I think, for about 25 years or over 25 years. He took over as the leader of the Senate Democrats once Harry Reid left in 2017. And he was the Senate Majority Leader for several years. Now, obviously, because the Democrats are the minority in the Senate, he is the Minority Leader. And while I'm not a huge fan, to be honest, of Schumer, very establishment, he's very, progressive on, social issues. I will also have to say, and just to be honest and be fair, that he's not known for being stupid or being timid, right? You don't get where he's at from being stupid or not willing to actually do what it takes to rise in politics. I'll remind people that the Senate is what they say the greatest legislative body in the world, right? Deliberative body in the world.
Yeah.
All right, you don't come up through that just by being a pushover. But right now, Cory, he is in a lot of trouble. Even some people in his party are asking for his resignation and all this other stuff. And he's receiving pushback from other Democrats for supporting the Republican spending bill last week. And he was joined by 9 other Democrats. Now, to be fair, he did say that he opposes the bill in substance. And even early on said that he wouldn't support it, but he was obviously bluffing, and that bluff got called. But what he was saying is that if the bill didn't pass, then it would lead to a government shutdown. Many in his party wanted to stop the bill. They wanted to use the filibuster. They wanted to use their leverage, and we'll talk about how much leverage that was, to resist the administration and force them to change this spending bill. Because obviously it has a lot of things in it that Democrats wouldn't otherwise vote for, right? Now, I'm gonna pass it to you in a second, but I want to give you Schumer's argument, right? So he argued that the shutdown would actually empower Trump and Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency, and that's what most people were kind of pointing at who wanted to stop it. He says this: a shutdown would shut down all government agencies, and it would solely be up to Trump and Doge and Musk what to keep open, because they would determine what is essential. So when there's a government shutdown, the executive office, the president, decides what actually has to stay open because it's essential, but because government is shut down, everything else has to shut down. A shutdown would have given him the power to do that. So he says their goal of decimating the whole federal government, of cutting agency after agency after agency, would occur under the shutdown. You would actually be helping them in what they're trying to do. That's what he was saying. The other thing that I will add to this is, it's interesting to me, and I'm sure that you have seen this, Cory, how when in a certain position, the parties actually make opposite arguments. Have you seen that, Cory?
Yeah.
Right. So if we look at this particular instance, last September, when the Republicans threatened to shut down the government, here's what some Democrats were saying. And I'm going to be honest with you. One of the quotes I'm going to give you is from Schumer. And I don't recall any Democrat pushing back against what he had to say right here when the shoe was on the other foot. He says, funding the government is the most basic responsibility in Congress. A shutdown would be a terrible outcome for the country, despite what some on the hard right have ludicrously would have us believe. It's hard for me to believe that some, the extreme right, in the other chamber, say they actually want to shut down the government. That's insanity. Here's what Pelosi had to say. I think the American people recognize that we must keep the government open, that a shutdown is not worth anything. Here's what Congresswoman Kathy Castor, another Democrat, had to say. This is no way to govern. But the last thing Florida families need is a government shutdown as Floridians prepare for Hurricane Helene, its difficulties and things of that nature. Some Democrats even said that the filibuster was a racist tool of Jim Crow, but now they're saying the filibuster should be used. Both parties do this when, they're in the position to do it. What would you have done, Cory, if you were Senator Schumer last week facing this shutdown and this decision?
I think Senator Schumer understands Republicanism better than his colleagues. If you take conservatism to its extreme, you get anarchy. I know a lot of people call Trump a tyrant and say, authoritarianism, but authoritarians don't make government smaller. They don't cut off their revenue streams by, historic tax cuts. They centralize government, right? And so when you look at the sort of golden age of authoritarians and tyrants in like the 30s and 40s, they were all like socialists and communists. They were not right-wing people. And I say all that to say this. Underground, at the Saturday morning party meetings and when conservatives get together, there's always been talk about a purposeful shutdown of government because government's doing too much. And this will shut government down. And if government is shut down, we can spend less. And so I think Schumer understood if you'll be giving them what they want by shutting down the government. There's a reason why every time we have a government shutdown argument, it seems like it's going one way. Because Republicans are fine with shutting the government down. Not your mainstream Susan Collins and Mitt Romneys of the world, but there's a large contingent of Republicans that are just fine. So I think Chuck Schumer saw that this was checkmate. He had two moves that he could make, and in both moves, he was going to be checkmated. So one move was we go and shut down, and when that, first of all, there would be no incentive on the right to reopen. So they would have took their time and made all of the cuts that they wanted to cut to agencies, to personnel, to programs, to budget. And when they got the government where they wanted it to be, then they'd have been like, let's open up. Checkmate. The second one is we give him what he wants. And that's a win for Donald Trump. And I think what AOC and what the others, Nancy Pelosi and others saw was that there's been a lot of movement and activity from the Trump administration, but no outcomes yet. And they needed this. He needed this. Not going into shutdown would have been, I think, politically harmful to Donald Trump because we got a lot of movement and disruption, but we don't have anything yet as an outcome. And I think he needs good news before bad news. And whichever comes first is probably going to chart the course for the next 2 years for him. And so he needs one of these, wars to end. He needs, one of these trade fights to turn into a trade deal. He needs something positive to happen, or he's going to be in a lot of trouble.
So you think Schumer made the right decision for his party?
I think he made the best decision for his party. I think they were checkmated either way they go. But I think he lost less going with the continuing resolution than allowing the government to shut down.
Yeah. So let me say this, and I talked about this a little bit last week. I empathize with Democrats right now, right? Obviously, I'm not a Trump supporter, number one. But two, there's this feeling of just helplessness, right? Like powerlessness. And so whenever you've seen an opportunity to actually push back and fight back, to show you have some fight, show it. They're like, please show us that we're not just powerless, hopeless, helpless, and that there's something that we can do. This presented an opportunity for them to step up and say, hey, we will push back. We'll make you make some hard decisions. I think that's where people are coming from. Like this was, let's show that we have it in us. Let's show we're willing to sacrifice and make it hard for them, so they're not just running roughshod over, whatever we want to do.
Yep.
Some people took it so far as to say, this is our opportunity to stop Elon Musk, and that's why I pushed back a little bit.
I think that would have been supercharged.
I do think there was an overestimation of the leverage that they actually had in this situation, right?
Yeah.
Given just the different standpoints and positions that Democrats and Republicans take. To your point, I don't think a lot of Republicans would have cared if it got shut down. To the extent that they could put it on the Democrats, then they would, and they would say they don't really believe in this. They said this and that. Now they want to shut down the government after they've always said that's not what should happen, right? So that's I think there was an overestimation of the leverage. Although I do understand why folks were saying, I think it was more emotional than actually strategic to say we got to do something.
I also think there's an overestimation on how much credibility the Democrats have right now. I think with the American people, they've lost a ton of credibility with the American people.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. And here's the other thing about Schumer. Anybody that's saying, oh, he's just soft, he's just dude, he's not in this position. He would never make it this far if that's who he was.
New York politics.
Right. And so what's going on here is from New York politics into the number one position in in Congress, bro. Come on, let's be serious. But anyway, I think what's happening here is, again, you have this response of saying we have to resist, which I get it. But you also have somebody who's a leader who has to think of the long term and not just how people are feeling right now. And he would say, well, everybody in the House voted against. Yeah, the House didn't have to really make the final decision of if it was going to be a shutdown. Jeffries didn't have to necessarily make that decision. So now what people can do, because their constituents are all on their backs, like y'all aren't doing anything, they can now go, see, I wanted to do something, but Schumer, it's on him. I wanted to go all in. And at the end of the day, some of this is cosplay, right? Because I think the best case scenario is you let it go into a shutdown over the weekend, maybe for a couple more days. You prove you have some fight in you, and then you go along with it anyway. The idea that Trump was going to negotiate this and take something out of this and put something in that they want, it wasn't going to happen. So I get where people are coming from, but I do think it's a little short-sighted, and it's just a bad situation for Schumer. Like, he could have acted, put up a little more of a fight, but.
And then that notion that not only would Trump not negotiate on terms because he wins either way, but also there's no incentive to reopen. What we're used to is the government shutting down on Friday and opening up on Saturday or opening up on Monday. That's not happening. This is going to be a shutdown that's going to last a month. And a lot of those guys who were employed going into the shutdown will be unemployed coming out of it. And there would have been a lot of agencies that would not open up. Like, this was not a win for the Democrats at all.
Now, here's something else, Corey. CNN just came out with a new poll showing that the Democrats' favorability is at 29%, which is the lowest since CNN has even started polling, which I think was in the early 90s. Now, before you get too excited, the Republicans are only at 37. All right, but that 29 is painful. What do you think that says about the party right now?
So,
and why aren't Republicans higher?
I think there's two dynamics here. Number one, Democrats have mastered the short game, right? So they mastered mainstream media. And they know how to do the sound bites. They know how to do, all of the things that you do on mainstream media, and they pretty much owned it and forced Republicans into the underground, which is the podcast, right? It's this long form where it's harder to gaslight, it's harder to just sort of get sound bites out. And so the Republicans have been playing on this platform for a while now. And this is where everybody is. And all the young people are here. They're on social media and they're on podcasts. And so I think one of the reasons is we're not hearing Democrats, right? The Democrats don't have people down here because you can't sort of make your case on some of the things that they're pushing for, like, sending young people into, reconstructive surgery, right? And calling it gender affirming care. Like, you can't make that case on a 2-hour long podcast and save face. You can do that on CNN. You can't do that here. And so the American people aren't really hearing Democrats except in those short forms. And then I think the second thing is when they went after Trump, okay, that's Trump's fault. But then when they saw the Democrats push Biden out, it's like, well, maybe they are behind these cases.
That's the trust factor you're talking about.
The trust factor just dropped. And I don't think most of the Democrats that are in Congress realize nobody's listening. It's like the scene on the Crumps where he said, "You think I'll be listening to you? I don't be listening to you." Yeah, I don't think the American people, the Democrats really realize how much credibility they've lost, and they have to build that back up.
Why aren't the Republicans higher, though?
I think that's a baseline for Republicans. We were between 37 and 42 for years.
So you're comfortable there?
I think we're we're past this era where anyone is going to be very high positives because it's too much access to information. Everything is negative. It's very difficult. Oh, and also our lives are much more transparent. And so I think it's just very difficult to see
the Republicans. So the Democrats are victims of themselves. You guys are victims of circumstance. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, I don't think the Republicans are very likable right now. Don't get me wrong, but I don't think there's another way. I think what Donald Trump is trying to do, and I go here every single time I wear your show, is he's literally trying to reverse something that the Davos crowd has been putting together for decades. He's trying to reverse the global world order. And these people don't care about you because of your race or because of your gender or because of your sex. They are concerned that their world order, the structure that they put together, is being turned down. They're trying to rile you up by saying he's racist or he's sexist or he's against gender. And so the reality is the Republicans are in a position where they have to always be in fight mode. And so because of that, the only time they have a safe space is when they're on podcasts. Mm-hmm. When they're in mainstream media, they're in fight mode. And they're not just fighting the Democrats. They're fighting the media. They're fighting career bureaucrats. They're fighting Europe. They're fighting everyone. And because they're trying to do something that is massive. And so I don't think they're ever going to be, not for another 10 years at least. Because look at J.D. Vance. He could be the next. J.D. Vance is already in fight mode and constantly, being an agitator. So what happens when he's running for president 4 years from now? He's not going to automatically become likable. I think it's going to be a while.
Let me ask you this real quick. So this poll also asks, who do you think the leader of the Democratic Party is? And I'm going to give you the top 10 or so, okay? Number 1 was AOC. Number 2, Kamala Harris. Then Bernie Sanders, Hakeem Jeffries, Barack Obama, and Jasmine Crockett both had 4%. Gavin Newsom, Nancy Pelosi, Elisa Slotkin, Chuck Schumer, Tim Walz. What do you take from that list?
Well, first of all, I think it's an unfair question, right? Every time the party that is out of power, there's a power vacuum.
Mm.
And we get this too, right? When Republicans out of power, oh, who's in charge of the Republican Party? Oh, they're following everything Trump says, And I was saying, hey, that's what parties do. They follow the nominee. They do what the nominee wants, and they do what the president wants. That's how that works. But I
Mm.
feel like when you don't have a nominee and you don't have a president, you have a power vacuum. So all the people who could be in charge are all trying to be the next president, or all trying to be the next speaker, all trying to be the next leader of the Senate. And so I think there's just a power vacuum. It's very competitive right now. Everybody's trying to move into their own faction. So they all have certain levels of influence and power, but there's no
So
leader.
that poll just doesn't mean very much right now.
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, every time a party is out of power, you're going to get that poll, and you're going to get people saying that and asking who's in charge. And I just think nobody's in charge right now, right? You're trying to figure out who we're
That's
going
a
to be.
problem. Yeah, right. That's a
That's
problem.
the problem,
But
but
you're right. When you get beat in that way, you
yeah,
don't have, you know what I mean? Like you
yeah.
got to kind of start from scratch and get it back together. So we'll see who kind of jockeys themselves up to the top. But I did find that to be interesting. We will be right back on the Church Politics Podcast.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, got off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
And we are back on the Church Politics Podcast. And we got my man, Cory Ruth, with us today. All right. So he's in here talking to us. The next subject I want to go back and forth with you on deals with human intelligence. I was on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, and I saw that John Byrne Madoc shared this. He said recent results from major international tests show that the average person's capacity to process information, use reasoning, and solve novel problems has been falling since the mid-2010s. Now, to be clear, he says that nobody would argue that the fundamental biology of the human brain changed in that span. All right. People's underlying intellectual capacity is surely undimmed. But there is growing evidence that the extent to which people can practically apply that capacity has been diminished. He says that one source that consistently comes up, and this I guess this research was done by monitoring the future in a survey they did, is that people are really just struggling to concentrate and to learn new things. And one argument about it, you see it in kind of the decline in reading, is that people's information diet shifts from longer and more complex text to shorter snippets, and text to video. It affects their ability to read and solve problems, because we're looking at all these things that are very quick, but not taking the time to dig deeply into certain things. We also saw this in The Atlantic recently, said that even elite college students don't read whole books.
Yeah.
They have problem reading whole books. What do you take from this, Cory? And is this something we should be worried about?
I'm back and forth on whether it's something we should be worried about. I think, I've been saying for years we need to start teaching kids how to cheat. Like, it's not important that kids
How to cheat?
how to cheat. Yeah. So I'm a technologist, right? So I'm in technology. So for me, I don't care. I wouldn't trust my company's finances to you. I don't care how brilliant you are. I'm going to have a software that does that, and you're going to interact with this software. You're going to input, and the software will output. And so for me, I'm like, as technology advances, I need you to be less knowledgeable
But we should still have those skills, though. I mean, you should still want people to understand what they're inputting and
I
the
think we need
basis
to,
behind
I
it.
think you need to be able, kids today need to be able to access the right information quickly. I'd rather you know how to prompt AI than to know what AI is going to tell you. It's just the nature of where we are. We've come I guess 360 actually, because we've gone from cavemen drawing um, on walls and being very visual communicators back to that. So we left that and started reading and writing, and where's cursive? No one uses cursive anymore. Who reads long form documents anymore? Like,
But let me ask you this, do we want to put all our problem solving in the hands of AI and not have any problem solving ability ourselves? I
I
mean,
don't.
I would I would be a little bit worried that we couldn't solve any problems. We just had to depend on technology to solve all our problems because we just couldn't think the same way. That seems problematic to me.
No, don't get me wrong. The best example I can give is when I started my career as a network analyst at Sprint, and Sprint had just gone through um, the implementation of this proprietary software to install and to test data circuits. Prior to that, those guys had all this theory. They had to pick up phones and send a signal and listen to see if that signal came back, and in order to troubleshoot where the problem is on that data circuit. By the time I got there, I just learned the software, and I was the best at using that software. And so I had all these old guys who had all this theory and who had graduated Georgia Tech and all this coming to me, a biblical studies guy and a history major, trying to figure out what to do. And I rose up the ranks fast because it seemed like I was the leader because I knew how to use the software. And I could teach a 14-year-old to do that. Now, don't get me wrong. When a unique problem surfaced, we needed those old guys who understood the theory to come in and figure out what the problem was and how we ought to troubleshoot it beyond just clicking on the
So
screen.
I'm guessing you would teach your children both, right? You might want them to know the theory, but also the technical side of actually how to get done. To me, that's what I wouldn't leave one or the other, right?
There's a baseline that everybody needs to have, right? You need to know how to read. But I don't know if I need to measure how fast you read anymore, right? I don't know if I need to measure those things. But then there's some kids that are going to show a particular aptitude in that area, keep them going. If you're really good at math at a young age, let's really invest in that kid learning that. If you're really good at reading and you're fast, great for you. Let's invest in that. But if you're not,
but we don't specialize that early for a reason, right? Because sometimes you don't know and it takes time. And, if we specialize too early, you can run into problems with that as well.
Now, I should say this as a caveat, because I don't want to be one of those people pushing this, but my kids are in classical education. They're learning Latin, they're reading, they're writing cursive, they're doing all of those things, because I do think reasoning is important. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to lose that.
You scared me a little bit.
Yeah, I just don't know yet how bad it'll be in a real way. In a practical way, because like the article said, it's not like our brains are changing. We still have the capacity to do this. It's about whether or not we have the practice and whether or not it's necessary. And I do think it's necessary for some people who aren't doing it and not necessary for some people who are. And we just need to find that right.
Yeah, I just think it's thinking human beings who, you're going to specialize at some point, but everybody needs to be able to problem solve. Everybody needs to be reading books because we have to not only interact with each other, understand the implications of the decisions that we make and things of that nature. We got to solve big problems to help people, and we don't know where exactly technology might take us. So I hear what you're saying. There's a practical side to it. I just think in general, we should be reading books. And a lot of this just comes down to technology. It comes down to social media, and the small snippets we get from social media has made us unable to concentrate for long for a long time. That's what it seems.
Yeah.
That's what it seems to be to me.
That's the big
I
problem.
think that becomes a
That's
problem.
it.
I think
That's the big
all the kids should be trying to read and all this stuff, and we should be limiting social media. One thing that Andy Crouch said in one of his books is Andy pointed out that we actually lose something the more technology we get. So remember, back in the day, you probably knew 10 people's phone numbers. You probably don't know 10 people's phone numbers.
Yeah.
Going further back, before the Bible was even written, this is something that people memorized and just knew. We don't. Maybe we have the capacity, to your point, to do it, but if we're not using that capacity, something is truly lost there. And so that's kind of my thought process on it.
But I'll just say this last thing. I also think it's important how we're measuring intelligence. So somebody could sit here and watch your podcast for an hour and be engaged, but and they may be able to, because it's on demand, they can come back and get pieces at different times. Whereas they're probably measuring this by how many books they read instead of how much information did you consume and do you remember it? And you may have consumed it differently. And it goes to people saying, well, these young kids today, they get all their news from TikTok. Well, TikTok is not a news agency, it's a platform. And I get all my news from Instagram, but it's not Instagram. I get it from Financial Times. I get it from New York Times. I get it from Wall Street Journal. I have subscriptions to those things. But when they pop up on my feed on Instagram and they interest me, I can click on it. It takes me to my subscription. And now
you're reading some of that and not just getting headlines. I
think what I'm saying. If I'm interested, I click on it. It takes me to my subscription and I can read the full thing. Or not read it. I can click on and listen to somebody else read it. And so it's just a lot of different ways that we can consume information, and we're still measuring it based on, did you read the whole book? And I think that's
not always necessary, but certainly in general, I would say, yeah. But no, I hear your point. I think there's a very practical side to this. As technology kind of moves forward, this is something we're really going to be having to deal with. But as always, Cory, man, greatly appreciate you being here with me, man. Hope to see you come back. Have a wonderful day, brother.
Thanks, man.
All right, now.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, got off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
And we are back on the Church Politics Podcast. Now, I told you guys that I wasn't only going to have one guest in this episode, but I was going to have two guests. All right. And so I want to once again introduce you to my friend, Dr. Ed Uszynski, who is a writer, who is a speaker on topics like sports and culture, race, marriage, and so on. He is the husband of Amy and the father of 4. And he is the author, as I said earlier, of Untangling Critical Race Theory, what Christians need to know and why it matters. Okay. The forward here, and I want to tell you this. I know a lot of you guys know Dr. Crawford Loritz. He did the forward to this book. So that says a lot. Ed, man, thanks for joining me.
Good to be here, Justin. Glad we were able to finally pull it off.
Yeah, it took a little while, but I appreciate the grace and the patience. We finally got here.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So I recently wrote an article in Christianity Today where I basically was saying that racial reconciliation is out of style. That I think, unfortunately and regrettably, that race relations in America are actually going backwards, that it has gotten worse since 2020 rather than better, right? There hasn't really been any progress. And in fact, I see a lot of Christians who have no intent on trying to make it any better right now. And that's on both sides of the conversation. Any thoughts about where we are when it comes to race today, and has it gotten worse?
Yeah, interesting, man. I actually read that article that you wrote and found myself nodding with it. And Look, I think people don't want to hear the bad news of having to say that we feel like we've gone backwards, or that it's out of style. I don't know how old you are. I'm 57. So I was born in 68. And I just feel like across the decades of my life, there's been windows of time where there were these racial quakes of something that happened in society that got everybody's attention in a way that was unavoidable, including in the church. There's attention that's paid to it for a while, and then it fades to the background again. And so even when we talk about how far we've come in the last 5 years, let's say since the George Floyd murder,
right.
It depends on who the we is, because I think there actually are many, many people who they have had an awakening. They have taken more seriously their own racial story and their place within it and the way that they interact with people that are different from them. And then I think very clearly there are people who have dug in deeper and dug their heels in deeper, that every time there's any kind of an awakening that takes place, there's always a reaction and an overreaction, a retrenchment, Devin Carbato calls it, against racial harmony and against people in the church. I guess that's really what I'm mostly concerned about, is what happens within the church.
Right.
Because we have a different mandate, right? We have a different king. We have a different kingdom that we're trying to live out. And so I think it's particularly discouraging when it seems like we've allowed ourselves to be pulled backwards by the cultural rhetoric, which I think has really happened. There's been a contamination within the evangelical world with the political rhetoric that's just not helpful. Yep. It's not helpful to living out gospel truth between people that are different from each other.
Yeah, you kind of see the political leading the spiritual and the church in a certain way. And I agree with you. That is regrettable. Let me ask you this. How did you get to writing this book? Give us a little bit of an idea of your journey as a white man writing about critical race theory and why you thought that was important.
Yeah. So I grew up in a very mixed environment. So just my own biography was very cross-cultural from the get-go, primarily white and Black. I lived on the west side of Cleveland, but also had a very strong Puerto Rican contingency that lived right in close quarters with each other. So just my own history has always had me in this conversation and always thinking across racial lines. My academic background, I did a couple of conservative theological degrees back in the day, back in the 90s, but then I did a PhD in American culture studies 15 years ago, where a main focus or a large segment of what we ended up reading was Marxist critical theory, critical race theory, all these different theoretical traditions were a huge part of what my PhD wound up being.
And I hate to interrupt you, but just to be clear, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, as of today, you are an Orthodox Christian, though, just so everybody, is that what you would consider yourself?
Man, that's important. Absolutely. I definitely am still holding to what would be historically considered conservative Orthodox positions on the Bible. And I'm very much in line with you, Justin, in the way that you talk about the Bible, the way you try to bring the Bible to bear socially, very much in your same tradition. But as a white person in the midst of evangelicalism, there's been very few white conservative voices that have tried to be bridge builders and have tried to be cultural translators or, again, whatever the right language is to say, help people understand, help white people in particular understand what Black brothers and sisters specifically, and really non-white brothers and sisters in the church have been trying to draw attention to for decades. And so with everything that happened in the last decade, and once critical race theory actually started to catch people's attention in the media and within my own circles, within my ministry and crew, I work with Athletes in Action, or have historically worked with Athletes in Action for 30 years. And we started talking more and using the language of critical theory and, all the argumentation that was happening politically. It just seemed like it was time for me to start putting pen to paper, as friends had been encouraging me to do for years. And I just, honestly, I felt a stewardship responsibility to be a voice that tries to help people slow down and look at what the real issues are behind specific theories within critical race theory, provide a primer on Marxism and critical theory. And again, these are huge ideas.
Right.
but I wanted to try to make them more understandable and do so in a way that I didn't feel like was being represented very well within conservative evangelicalism.
Right. Now, give me a summary of what critical race theory is, because one of the issues I know that you run into is you got people that talk a lot about critical race theory, have all these issues with it, but really don't know what it is. Right? You find out that they're not exactly sure what they're talking about. So I don't want our audience to be ignorant of that. Can you give us a summary of what critical race theory is? And the beauty of this book is it's not really just about critical race theory. Critical race theory happens to be a part of it, but just explain to us what that is.
Yeah. Well, and so again, let me just say what it's not. It's never was intended to be a catch-all term for every progressive move, every politically progressive move that takes place in our society. That's really what it's come to mean. It's come to be like this catch-all term for everything that happens under progressivism. And in some ways, I almost feel like I wound up and have been doing this for years, defending what the original critical race theorists were after. And really what they were doing in the late 80s, early 90s, they were offering a counter narrative to how race was being talked about in society, which frankly isn't much different than how it's talked about today in society. And that is that kind of the ethos was, we're good now. We're post-racial. We're past our evil past. The 60s got a lot of that worked out. And now we're all good. We're in a meritocracy. We're in a place where it's an equal starting line for everybody. And the original critical race theorists just said, that's ridiculous. That's always been ridiculous. And in our specific lane of law, we're going to show how law continues to function as a weapon of racial power to bring about disparities between people. The law does that. And so if the narrative was that we're all good now when it comes to race, the critical race theorists said, no, racism is interwoven into everything that has happened in our society, and it continues to have effects today. If the story is that we're all colorblind now, the critical race theorists said that's ridiculous and naive, and it's impossible to be colorblind in light of our several century history that we share. And just on and on. Again, all these kind of talking points that have become so significant politically when it comes to privilege, when it comes to how power has worked to continue to maintain disparity. That's still really what's getting talked about today, isn't it, Justin? Yeah. In so many different ways, whether it's DEI or just, does there need to be some kind of reparation made because of the way patterns and policies and procedures have continued to play themselves out racially? Does there need to be some kind of an adjustment? And the critical race theorists were saying yes, and here's some ideas on what we would suggest needs to happen to bring about change.
And that shouldn't be foreign to Christians, in my opinion. I mean, if you read the Bible, so what's happening is they're saying, hey, here's an abuse of power. Here's how this or that is misused and manipulated to mistreat people. When I read the book of Amos, I kind of see him coming in and say, hey, there's an abuse of power. This isn't what it should be. There's a critique of society. And we know that when any group is in power, they're going to use language and other things to their advantage. That's just our brokenness. And we see that being pointed out in the Bible. Why do you think there's such a just an aversion to hearing hearing the idea in general?
Well, and again, man, I'm saying you've spoken so well about this for so long, Justin, because people are more affected by their politics than they are their prophets. I think people that they're getting they're getting fed regularly from Fox News or from CNN and not from Amos. Again, in some ways, it's as simple as that. I think people hear language that's actually is all over the Bible, and they immediately think Marxism, or they immediately think something that they've heard on the political stage, and they're not really informed by a Christian worldview. It's in some ways it's as simple as that, and I just think that that's getting worse. Combined with the fact, again, I'll say this as a white man who has lived and spent most of his time in white evangelicalism, that there is a discomfort to having to change the narrative we tell ourselves about ourselves when it comes to race. I mean, we want to believe that things are okay and that, I would have done differently on my watch if I had been around in the civil rights time. And, I would have voted for Obama for a third time if I could have in this sort of talk, and have really I would say a very naive, and I'll say this, I've been talking about this a lot lately. I just think we have a naive understanding of how Satan uses race and racism across history around the globe. And we have our particular version of it here in this country with its own history and its own nuances. But it's common to what Satan has done from the beginning of time to mar the imago Dei, to mar the way that we relate with one another as human beings, especially within the church. And he will continue to distort it and twist it until Jesus returns. And so this idea that again, I say this to my white brothers and sisters, that somehow we're past this now, or we're all better now, or, that was then, but this is now. This kind of language just seems so naive. Mm-hmm. If you just understand spiritual warfare and you understand the schemes of Satan and how he has effectively used racism to destroy what God's trying to do between people.
No, that's good.
Right? So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think one of the things you pointed out that stuck out to me was people's commitment to this kind of histomythology, right? Like it's partially history, it's partially the myth that always exalts us, and it really becomes an idol. And unless we're willing to let go of that mythology, we can't really accept things that we've done wrong, things that we have to correct. And I think that does play a role in what's going on in our society right now. Let me ask you this as we kind of wind down. Anytime I bring somebody on here, I try to always ask people. So if you're talking about capitalism, socialism, any type of system or idea or concept, I want to hear what you have to say. But I also believe that people, when we take a theory or a system into the church, we also need to tell people where that system or theory or concept could run afoul of the gospel. How could critical race theory, because I've critiqued critical race theory. I've told people it's not the boogeyman that you think it is, but it can go wrong. How can critical race theory or certain critical race theorists, and you don't have to necessarily say their name, how can this idea go afoul of what the gospel would call us to do?
Well, shoot, Justin, you just said it. I don't think that most critical race theorists are analyzing society through a Christian worldview. So right from the get-go, I'm suspicious of anybody that's not putting Jesus in the center of things. Okay, so, and even just to be clear, and we have got a short time here. People don't know me. I'm not an advocate of we need critical race theory in the church. I'm not trying to bring critical race theory into the church. What I think, though, we can do is we can learn from the questions that it gets us to raise. That's what I've always thought was the value of a good theorist, somebody that looks at society and is doing so from a non-Christian perspective, but is analyzing what they see in society and how power is being used. You use that language. And so I think critical race theorists at their best should cause us within the church to ask questions like, what patterns and policies and procedures maybe have we put in place or allowed to stay in place that continue to hinder dividing walls being torn down? That's a great question that comes from theorists. Now, it's in their solutions at times that I've say, no, I need to hit pause on that. If the solution that is provided or suggested is basically just replacing one injustice with another, okay, and again, we could get into the weeds of that, then that's where I have to say, well, no, that's not coming from a biblical worldview. That's not coming from a kingdom-inspired view of the way people should relate to each other and what justice would look like in this moment. Now, again, I know there's different opinions about that, but that's where I call time out really every day in the midst of listening to different opinions about how to fix this, that, or the other. And I just say, yeah, that doesn't smell like the kingdom to me.
That's good.
The kingdom would look very different.
Mm-hmm.
And it should look different on our watch. Again, I keep trying to even differentiate between the conversation that's happening about race or any other hot topic, ethical topic, on the political and social level versus what's happening in the church. Of course, there's some overlap, but I want to separate those and say, how should the kingdom look different?
Yeah.
It should be a very different conversation. How have we gone off the rails? Sometimes because we've embraced too much, like you said, the mythology that we need to let go of and shed ourselves of and get back to what it would actually look like if the kingdom was being lived out in this space. And those are hard and messy conversations, man, that if you won't even let yourself get into ask that question, then it's no wonder that we have the problems that we still continue to have when it comes to race in the church, because we're not even having the right conversations, I don't believe.
Man, that is really good. Let me tell the audience something real quick. There are people who stay in their safe spaces and they do stuff that they're allowed to do and don't really take any chances. And then there are prophetic people who take big chances because God called them to do that. I think Ed is in that second group of someone who went out on a subject that's not easy to talk about, that people don't want to hear, but felt that God wanted him to do it, and that this was what he was called to do in the church. And I appreciate it. And so I want all of you to go look this book up and grab this book. It is, again, Untangling Critical Race Theory, What Christians Need to Know and Why It Matters. Go check it out, guys. Ed, thank you so much for your time. Anything else you'd like to add before you go?
No, man. Hey, I appreciate your voice, Justin. And even as you said, it's not trending right now to be in the spaces that we're in. It never has been. And I'm going to continue to pray for you and others like you that you keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, right back at you, brother. Thank you for having me, man. Thank you for being with me, man. Greatly appreciate you. All right, ANCAP, I hope you enjoyed this episode with our great guests. But y'all know what it is. There's a cross that neither political conservatism nor progressivism is fit to bear. There's a civic hearing and neither faithful witnesses who love social justice and won't surrender the truth to be loved by the world. Politic with the boldness and compassion of Jesus Christ. Until next time, ANCAP, we'll holla at you.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, got off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.